Hi, everyone, and welcome to this week's Community Archives lecture, Community Archives in Activism. So we'll be looking at a few weekly topics for this week. What is archival activism? What is the link between archival activism and community archives? And how are activist archives examples of liberatory memory work? So we'll start by talking about archival activism in general and kind of nestled underneath that activist archives as well. So archival activism and activist archives are essentially challenges to traditional archival practice and to power dynamics in society. So the Safer article talks about how when archivists campaign on issues such as access rights or participatory rights within records control systems, or act to deploy their archival collections to support activist groups in social justice aims, they are engaging in archival activism. They are activist archives. So there you can see the challenges both to, again, kind of traditional archival practice and inequality in society. So in a lot of ways, archival activism is, as the C4 article mentions, a response to challenges, but also a challenge themselves. So challenging the power dynamics both within archives and within society as a whole, and uh, seeking ways to address those inequalities. So looking at the notion of activist archives and archival activism challenging traditional archival practice, the C4 article talks about how when archives assert themselves as being activists, that can open up the archive to new concepts of archival practice. So practices that depart from more traditional archival practices that have contributed to white supremacy and patriarchy and some of the other things that the Caswell chapter from a couple of weeks ago mentioned. So a rejection of these colonial and extractive archival practices, a rejection of the idea of archival neutrality, which has led to a presence in archives of one voice and not other voices. So essentially saying, we reject these practices and we're going to find ways for our archives to operate that is more empowering for the people represented in our archives. And so one of these ways is through participatory archiving, which the Flynn chapter for this week talks about. So this concept where people represented in records are contributing to record keeping decisions surrounding those records. So if I'm in records in an archive or in a collection, I should have some say in how those records are arranged and described, preserved, and so on. And obviously, this is a pretty stark departure from how a lot of archives have operated in the past and how many archives operate today. The Flynn article talks about how, at least in the past, participatory archiving has been kind of uh, superficial and not very quality, or yeah, not very equal, hasn't promoted a lot of equality between archivists and people represented in the records, despite the fact that the archive is trying to be quote unquote more participatory. Um, but that is a pretty stark departure from archival orthodoxy, archival tradition. And again, it is something that an archive that builds itself as being activists or engaging in activism may be more inclined and more open to incorporating. And as I've talked about before this course, participation is an essential aspect of community archiving. And we'll talk about participation a lot more in this class, so I won't belabor the point too much, but it's definitely an important part of activism and activist archives. The Brown article talks about how activist archives are often sites of radical history making, organized to preserve the histories of social movements and focus on documenting the activists, affects, and ephemera that more established archives reject. So again, we see a departure from the types of records that archives in the past have thought to be important and have brought into the archives, and activist archives have been the ones that have said, well, we feel that these records have value because they do document the experiences and histories and struggles of particular communities, and so we are going to bring them into our repository, even though they've been rejected by more mainstream archives. So if you look at how activist archives and archival activism challenges inequalities in society, there's a fair amount about that in our readings for this week too. So the C4 article talks about how archival activism can challenge the direct effects of marginalization, such as gentrification. Again, things that are caused by and solidify white supremacy in society. So it's interesting that the concept of activist archives and archival activism seeks to challenge archival practices and how they have contributed to white supremacy and other inequalities in society, and also how they have addressed them without necessarily going through archives. So kind of like um, maybe more a direct impact on white supremacy by challenging some of the social conditions that lead to things that reinforce white supremacy. The Flynn and Sexton article talks about how archives with activist interventions are meant to bring voice and agency in and around the archive that are invoked to bring about more socially just futures for underrepresented, marginalized, and silenced groups. So again, this idea of equality and empowering people. And it's interesting to think about what can be some of the positive and negatives associated with activism in archives, whether they be community archives or mainstream archives. I think the word activist and activism makes people think of particular things, protests and disruptions, um, and that may lead people to maybe have more, I guess, negative thoughts and emotions about activism and activists. And that's something that the C4 article touched on. Some of the community archivists were reluctant to be called activists because they're kind of concerned about the connotations that people have when it comes to activism. And we'll talk about in just a minute the things that archival activism can involve that don't involve standing in a street and waving signs or chaining yourself to a door or some of the other things that people might think of when they think of activism. There are a lot of different types of activism that archives can engage in. Um, but yeah, just because of that kind of negative connection that a lot of people have, that can make people kind of feel a little bit squeamish about being associated with activism. And I think that would be especially true with more traditional or mainstream archives who might have a mission that is sort of further afield from activist endeavors and may have stakeholders supporting their archive that would maybe frown more on an archive engaging in quote unquote activist actions. But at the same time, especially with community archives, activist engagement can can result in a community feeling more connected to an archive, more involved with the archive if they see the archive as either being involved in activist actions itself or supporting activist actions by the community members. That can really kind of galvanize the connection between community archive and community members. Um, for mainstream archives, I feel like a lot of the a lot of the things that we've talked about just in this lecture and off and on throughout this course just make for better archiving, right? If you are having some kind of participation that results in a more complete understanding of the context of a record or results in more accurate descriptions of a community or a person or an event or results in records being preserved in a way that is, culturally appropriate, like that's a good thing, right? It makes archives better. So it's interesting that participatory archiving is seen as kind of this, wild activist act when at the end of the day, it can result in the development of a lot of practices that can just make archives better. And I think that participatory archiving is maybe becoming less and less um, of a sort of albatross for archives and something that is more and more widely accepted. I'm seeing more and more articles about participatory archiving, so maybe it will be viewed as more of a kind of mainstream action in the future, but I'm not really sure how many archives are actually doing participation or how kind of deep and meaningful it is. So we'll kind of see where the future goes on that one. But an important thing to know about archival activism is, as I sort of touched on, it can be carried out by archivists themselves. It can be carried out by records creators, or it can be carried out by community members. So it doesn't necessarily have to be the archives being the ones that are involved in activist activities, right? Archivists can just kind of supply the ammunition that community members can use to go out and, protest or do some of the other things that archival activism can be associated with. So archives don't necessarily need to, quote unquote, get their hands dirty. They can just sort of provide the foundation for these social justice actions to take place. Okay, so we'll look a little bit more about some of the different aspects of archival activism. This is from the Flynn and Sexton article. These are some of the things that they mention um, archival activism can include. And, again, these things aren't necessarily uh, protesting in the streets, right? Mobilizing solidarity, just sort of building consensus within the community surrounding a particular issue, exploring identity through history. That could just be as simple as collecting records related to a community's history and providing them to that community, not like a hugely um, sort of transgressive action, right? Developing educational materials, intervening in public debates, documenting human rights abuses. These things don't necessarily have to involve people, again, taking really sort of public disruptive actions, right? Um, so it's just important to keep in mind the different ways that activist archives and archival activism can challenge the power structures both within how archives are operated and how society works in a way that is not necessarily as confrontational as people might assume. And I think that if you understand that and you recognize that, then it maybe leads to more archives and more archivists feeling comfortable about engaging in these kind of practices if they realize that they don't necessarily have to be, out on the streets or whatever. So next we'll talk about how archival activism connects with the idea of community-centric archiving that we have talked about a fair amount in this course. So yeah, what kind of connections can we make between some of the different characteristics of archival activism, some of the different aspects of archival activism with this community-centric framework? I think we can look and see how does this community-centric framework possibly create a situation in which some of the challenges to inequalities in society and inequalities found within archives, how can we kind of connect those two? So if we talk about looking at community records and materials are understood and valued in their originating context, as I sort of touched on before, this can be done really well through participatory archiving, right? Uh, it can Participatory archiving can just allow archivists to have a better understanding of what's going on simply because if you are helping people who were, involved in events or a part of a particular community and helping to determine what the context of these records are, you're probably going to get a more accurate view, right? As long as you are sort of doing your research and working with the people that were actually involved. Um, and if records are understood in their originating context, then that's less likely to create a situation in which stereotypes or misrepresentations about a community continues to exist because it's just an archivist sort of deciding what is what instead of people who actually know what they're talking about. And anytime stereotypes or misrepresentations of a community exist, whether they're perpetuated through archives or through the media or through whatever venue, that can result in a community being marginalized and being excluded because they're seen as being sort of less worthy or less important. If you don't know the accomplishments of a community because you're not really understanding the records that you're looking at in the proper context, then you may not realize, oh, this community really does have a long history here. And, you know, I feel like they should have more of a say in politics, so they should have more of a representation in media. If you look at understanding community complexity and flux, obviously participatory archiving can help with that a lot. If you have people, again, sort of understanding what the community used to look like, what the community looks like now, how that's changed, how the demographics of the community has changed, and that's recognized and honored and brought to bear in archival practice. Participatory archiving can be really, really valuable towards making that happen. And again, if you understand the complexity of a community, you understand that it's not just this kind of flat representation that you might see in archives or in society, maybe that helps you appreciate a community more or have a better understanding of where they're coming from and what they've been through. And, maybe as a person from outside of that community, that helps you feel more like this community should have more of a say in what goes on in the city or state or country that they live in, right? So there are a lot of connections between this idea of archival activism and the inequality it seeks to address, again, both within archival practice and with society as a whole, that we can connect to this idea of community-centric archiving. So as I touched on before, it's important to note that archival activism can exist along a spectrum, and it's not an all or nothing uh, concept or set of activities. So you could have a situation in which an archive is engaged in, what you might consider a pretty low level of archival activism. So, maybe it's just helping a community explore its identity through history. Maybe it's developing educational materials for a community. That could be something as simple as a collection guide saying, here are all the collections that we have about your community. It could be something like exhibits, it could be workshops, for a community about that community's history, kind of based on the records that are within archives. Again, not like uh, chanting on the streets level type stuff, right? And then you might have archives that are engaged in kind of a more moderate level of archival activism. So uh, doing these things, but also maybe helping the community learn from its past struggles and helping the community realize, this is what's gone on in the past. And, perhaps that can help you now as you're struggling to gain or regain power in society. So a little bit more focused on actively empowering members of society and helping them have the tools that they need to fight marginalization and exclusion. And then you can have an even higher level of archival activism, which includes all the ones I mentioned before, plus things like mobilizing society, intervening in public debates, trying to actively change policies and discriminations, documenting human rights abuses. So, obviously a pretty high level of archival activism if you are working with a community to really interject its perspective in public debates, if you're really helping a community mobilize solidarity behind an issue that they are facing in a given area at a particular time. So these are obviously really focused on addressing inequality and addressing a lack of power by a particular group within society, more so than a lower level or more moderate level of activism might do so. And it's important to, as an archive, and especially if you are community archive seeking to represent a particular community, it's important to support or encourage whatever level of activism your community is comfortable with and feels good about. There may be communities that have been harmed by people in power in the past, and they don't really want to rock the boat too much. So maybe they feel comfortable with community archives that are involved in a lower level of archival activism. Or it could be a community that is facing, really strong oppression right now, and they need all the resources that an archive has in order to support things like mobilizing solidarity and intervening in public debates. That's just going to depend on what the community wants. And, you know, community archives and activist archives in general shouldn't really be the tail that wags the dog, right? They should be ones who are kind of supporting community members, perhaps being involved in these activities in the past, but at the same time, not getting too far out of their skis and maybe getting ahead of what the community actually wants and what the community feels comfortable with. It's also important to note that kind of the higher you get on the spectrum of activism, the more resources and the more engagement it's going to take. So if you're an archive that simply wants to help community explore its identity through history and develop educational materials, that can be done in a fairly straightforward manner. If you are an archive that is trying to do things like mobilize solidarity and intervene in public debates, that can take a lot of effort and that can take a lot of time and a lot of resources. And it may be that this higher level of activism is kind of beyond what a community archive can even provide, right? Because all archives are more or less resource starved, and for community archives, that's especially true. So not only should community archives not kind of get ahead of the community as far as what level of activism the community is comfortable with, but they shouldn't get ahead of the level of activism that they they are actually able to support. So you kind of don't want to overpromise the community and say, "Oh yeah, we'll be there to help you intervene in public debates and really try and change some of the policies and discrimination that we see going on, if you as a community archive can't really deliver on those promises because you might have a community that's depending on you and you're not actually able to provide the support that you had hoped to, and you might leave people who are engaging in these processes that you said you would support to be kind of dangling in the wind a little bit. And that's not going to be something that is going to support the health and well-being of your community, and it's not something that is very community-centric, to say the least. Okay, so next we'll talk about some of the connections between community archives and archival activism. So as the Safor article notes, community archives movements developed in large part as a response to the social and political movements that came to the fore in the 1960s and 1970s, including the civil rights, gay liberation, and women's movements. So these activist movements inspired, in a lot of instances, community archives. So community archives were born of activist experiences that community members were undergoing. And the Safor article talks about how community archives were connected to activist ideals of promoting community empowerment and social change. So they were developed as ways for community members to fight the inequalities and marginalizations that they were seeing in society and work against them, which, as we have talked about, is kind of a defining feature of archival activism. And so within community archives, the collections were viewed as tools for making changes, and they were a crucial means of self-representation, identity construction, and empowerment, also from the C4 article. So community archives were born from activist actions, from activism, and they were meant to support a continuation of that activist action. And this makes me think of the Carter article from our first week of this semester, where members of a neighborhood were facing gentrification. They are facing sort of misrepresentation of their community in the public and in official records, and so they created a community archive to fight against that. Right? That's sort of the an example of what C4 is talking about as far as the connection between activism and community archives. The Flynn and Sexton article talks about how oftentimes citizen and community archivists are motivated by political activism. And, they're strongly associated with movements dedicated to challenging some of the inequalities that I've talked about in this lecture. So silences, symbolic annihilations, misrepresentations, and the existence of community archives is a representation of the inequalities and exclusions and silences in society. So we have this situation where we have a community with a shared identity and shared experiences some kind of trigger, a lack of accurate representation, a sense of marginalization, a sense of viability as a community. So we feel like we can do this, we can kind of bond together as a community, band together as a community, and they attempt to fight back for self-representation and against marginalization. So you can argue, at least on the face of it, there is a strong connection between community archives and this idea of activism. And to revisit some of the different activities that activist archives can engage in, looking at a perspective through community archives can support a lot of these things that we've talked about, right? They can mobilize solidarity within the community. They can be sort of a resource that community members can rally around when they are trying to reach consensus about how to respond to something or whether or not to respond to something that they see going on in the world. They can develop some of the educational materials that I talked about, exhibits, workshops, collection guides. They can help community members intervene in public debates by providing, maybe examples of past marginalization that a community has experienced, or examples of marginalization that a community is experiencing right now. So there's definitely a strong potential for community archives to support these types of actions and support political activism within a community. Now, again, a community archive may not necessarily have the resources to engage in all of these things. They may not have the resources to help a community learn from past struggles. Say if they only have holdings, from the last 5 or 10 years, and they don't really have things from previous generations of a community that community members can draw from in order to learn from past struggles. So a lot of this is just going to depend on the infrastructure that a community archive has and how well a community archive and a community is able to use that infrastructure to accomplish some of these different types of archival activism. Next, we'll talk about the link between archival activism and the sense of representational belonging, which, as we've described in this course, is sort of the ultimate resource or purpose that a community archive can strive for. Kind of the ultimate purpose of a community archive is to provide this sense of representational belonging. So I think it's interesting to look at how some of these different types of potential activist acts can connect to this sense of representational belonging. So this sense of I am here, we were here, we belong here. Okay, so if you look at, let's start with exploring identity through history. If you, as an archive, help a community or help a community member understand how the community has changed over time, sort of the history that the community has had, that can definitely give them a sense of we're here, right? We have been here for however long. A sense that we belong here. We have been in this community for X number of years. And our identity might have changed over time, but our community still has deep roots in, this town or city or state. And it can also help a person develop a sense of I am here. I am a part of a community that has a complex history, a complex identity, and that makes me feel more connected to the community that I am a part of. And so again, where these three concepts overlap, you have this sense of representational belonging. Developing educational materials, kind of along the same way, can really give a person a sense of where they're coming from, a sense of how they fit in to a particular geographic area, and also it can help a person have a sense of how they fit in with the community. So, I see that there have been bisexual people in Shorewood for years and years and years, and I'm able to see that through educational materials that that the archive, whether it's a community archive or a mainstream archive, has developed. So through the exhibit that I went to, through the workshop that I went to, so on and so forth. Learning from past struggles, in order to understand the past struggles of a community, obviously you have to understand the community's history, right? So we were here. This is what we struggled with, 20 years ago. we belong here because of the way that we have overcome these struggles. That proves that we belong in this location. And I am here. I see my uh, how previous generations of my community, how older members of my community struggled, and maybe that is equal to some of the same struggles that I'm experiencing now, and that helps me feel more of a sense of being a part of a community. So if we can say that community archives are activist archives, and that they seek to support this sense of representation and belonging, and kind of the higher purpose of existing is to support this sense of representational belonging, then I feel like you can make a lot of connections between these different types of archival activism and developing a sense of representational belonging. So if community archives do pursue some of these different types of activism, and again, it doesn't have to be anything as extreme as intervention in public debates. It certainly can be, but it doesn't have to be. You can still help your community members as an archive develop this sense of representational belonging, which can have a lot of really positive impacts on the community, both now and in the future as well. However, it's important to note that the Brown article takes issue with how well archives that seek to represent the LGBTQ plus community, how well they're able to support this sense of representational belonging, and uh, how much of activist archives they really are these days. And the author argues that in a lot of ways, LGBTQ plus archives have essentially become mainstream archives to people that feel like they are outside of the sort of cis white gay and lesbian identities that are so widely represented in these archives. So he talks about the author talks about how the archives, I'm not sure if that's the correct way to pronounce it, is a case study in what happens when a community archive can be understood simultaneously as both an activist radical archive from the perspective of the state and or the mainstream archives profession, and the epitome of a mainstream white cis-normative archive from the perspective of many others, such as queer women, trans people, and people of color. And the author essentially argues that community archives, instead of being activists and engaging in activism, supplement the power structures uh, as opposed to challenging them. So they don't help people that fall out of a particular identity within the LGBTQ plus community to feel a sense of representational belonging. They aren't community centric towards members of that community that fall outside of a certain umbrella and a certain identity that is so prevalent in in the LGBTQ plus community. And yeah, if you are an archive that is just kind of supporting the status quo and you are no longer engaging in efforts to sort of challenge the power dynamics in society, so you're sort of content with representing one section of the LGBTQ plus community, and you're not as interested in documenting the experiences of other members of that community, which may be currently experiencing, exclusion and marginalization and harm and danger. You can obviously trans people everywhere are experiencing um, exclusion and marginalization and harm. You read about things relate to that like pretty much every day. You know, they're sort of the 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 part of society that, you know, certain people in power want to kind of pick on and hold up as being the other and want to marginalize. You know, obviously it's a horrible thing, and the author is essentially saying community archives are no longer working towards correcting that wrong, and because of that, they are in a lot of ways a part of the problem and not a part of the solution. And you know, that's obviously, if you agree, you know, that's a betrayal of a lot of the reasons why community archives were created in the first place. And the author talks about kind of the background of the creation of our archives, and you know, the fact that it was like raided and its records were stolen and they had to like sue to get them back. You know, this really sort of exclusionary process that they engaged in, but now the author feels in a lot of ways that sort of activist spirit has been lost, and and trans people and people of color and queer women are not being represented in that archive uh, to an extent that they should be, and to an extent that would help them have a sense of representational belonging, have a sense that they were here, we belong here, and I am here. Which leads me to my next slide. How are activist archives examples of liberatory memory work? How can they uh, how can they truly be forces in society that are seeking to upset the status quo and seeking to continue to challenge power structures that are in society? So in the casual chapter for this week, the author talks about rejecting the idea of unidirectional progress. So rejecting this notion that a community has continued to sort of become more and more better off over time, and not reflecting the reality that there are sort of ebbs and flows in the well-being of a community. So just, you know, representing the reality of a community as opposed to kind of the idealized meta narrative about a community. And we'll talk about meta narratives next week. Um, but yeah, just being more open and honest about what a community is going through, and how, you know, they were struggling in the past. In a lot of ways, they may still be struggling today, and because of that, there needs to be a continued effort to right the inequalities that are going on in society. And so Brown talks about, you know, there are some parts of the queer community that have thrived, and as I touched on before, there are others that are still suffering. And if archives no longer sort of represent that reality, then they're kind of contributing to the status quo, contributing to, you know, transphobia and other negative aspects of society. And you know, that obviously isn't something that is going to achieve activist and liberatory memory goals and work. Caswell talks about the importance of activist archives being resources for contemporary struggles, not future study. So as much as possible, using the records that they have to really get out there and really contribute to inequalities that are going on, instead of just kind of saying, well, you know, we'll hold on to these and maybe someone will need them in 10 years and we'll be here. So just having more of an interventionist and activist mindset as opposed to just kind of being more passive and saying, well, you know, we're here if someone needs us. I mean, there's certainly value in that. And I think that, again, archives can contribute in sort of low grade activism by doing things that are kind of on that level. But if you, as an archive, really want to engage in liberatory memory work, you know, it takes a little bit more proactivity and a little bit more involvement than that. the Brown article talks about the need for ongoing political commitment. So instead of reaching a point where the archive says, well, things are looking pretty good for us right now. We're just going to kind of sort of coast along on the status quo. And boy, wasn't that a tough struggle? But look at where we are. They realize that members of their community continue to struggle. And, in the context of this article, Brown again is talking about uh, members of the trans community, um, people of color within the LGBTQ plus community, and the fact that they're still suffering and that the struggle isn't over. And again, Brown feels like a lot of LGBTQ plus archives in Canada, and I would imagine this is true for the US as well, have sort of lost an understanding of that, or lost the ambition to continue to fight the battle and engage in activist activities to make a better world for all members of their community, as opposed to just sort of saying, well, things are good for uh, people who identify as being gay and lesbian and are white, so let's just call it a day. So it has to be a sustained practice, not just something where you kind of sit back and say, okay, all done. It has to be ongoing. Because anytime you sort of back down and you let the status quo creep back into society, that's going to be a situation where people are being marginalized and excluded. Maybe I'm just being a cynic, but I think that's kind of human nature. Anytime people can devise a way to make themselves feel better than others and make themselves feel more deserving of resources and power than other people are, that's what they're going to do. And if there isn't something in place to kind of check that, if there aren't archives and other organizations engaging in activism and engaging in liberatory memory work on a sustained basis, that's what society is going to look like. Again, call me a cynic, um, but that's how I feel, and I don't know. I don't feel like I'm too far off base here, if at all. So yeah, it does take sustained, ongoing commitment, and that takes sustained community interest. It takes sustained resources and infrastructure. It's not an easy thing to fight a battle into perpetuity, right? Uh, and that's why it's so important to think about sustainability and participation in some of the other issues that we'll talk about in this course. But essentially, in order for activist archives to be examples of liberatory memory work, they just have to be community centric. They have to care about their community. They have to represent the community actively. They have to understand the complexity of the community and represent that to the public, because otherwise, people are going to find ways to stereotype and exclude, and that's not what liberatory memory work is meant to do, right? It's meant to challenge and not just accept. So that is a big part of it, is just living up to the community-centric nature of archives that we have talked about in this course. Okay, so that's all that I have. I hope you learned more about activism and what it can look like in archives, how community archives and maybe to a lesser extent mainstream archives can contribute to activism. I just got a little pumped up just talking about kind of the need for sustained battle and fight. So that's my dopamine for the day. And I hope it lit a little spark within you as well. So thank you for listening. Have a great week, and let me know if you have any questions.